Ahoy! Today I wanted to talk about the best ways to farm gold in Brimstone Sands. But as of today, one of the best methods, if not the best method, has been nerfed quite drastically. This is not mentioned in the patch notes for today's patch, so we'll talk about that first, and then we talk about the changes from the patch itself too, because those affect your farm as well in other ways. So if you were in early, you got a fair bit of an advantage with Brimstone Sands, as with a lot of the farms in New World in the past too. The farming method that was silently hit this morning, without even dropping a patch for it, so I have no idea how that actually worked, was a nerf to Sulfur. Before today, there were two methods to farm Sulfur chunk. You could either mine the Brimstone itself that we find around the pools, but that on one hand is quite annoying because you have to deal with the acid, and on the other hand they have relatively slow spawns and there aren't that many Brimstones, so it'll take fairly long overall. Or you could farm the Scorpions. Not only do the Scorpions have a faster respawn time, there are also plenty more of them, and you don't have to deal with the acid pools, because if a Scorpion is in a pool, you can just pull it out of there, and a lot of them aren't even in the pools to begin with. All in all, farming these Scorpions around the pool was vastly more efficient than going for the Brimstone. Ideally, it obviously combined both. On my server, initially, Sulfur chunks sold for a ridiculous amounts of gold, for like 200 plus per chunk, and you could get 4 chunks from a single mob. Then later that would go down to a bit more reasonable prices of like 50 gold per chunk, but it was still a lot because everyone needs these right now, because you need them for all the hard rune upgrades and you also need them for the rune glass gems. So to me, them being available from multiple sources actually seemed logical. But either through a bug or through a conscious decision from Amazon, the Sulfur chunks were removed as a drop from the Scorpions. I was still farming them myself this morning and they still dropped. There was this chance sometimes that a Scorpion would only drop lodestone and no sulfur chunks, but most of the time you'd get at least 1 and up to 4. A couple hours later, 2 of my company mates tried and neither of them got any sulfur chunks anymore at all. This isn't the first time that AGS has done something like this. We've seen something similar with the wolves, for example, in the past, which used to drop quintessences and larger amounts of wood, and then over time that got nerfed because they didn't want them to give that many resources that are primarily meant to be gathered from resource nodes. But our journey with the Sulfur doesn't end here. None of this was mentioned in the patch notes at all, but in the patch that came out today, the drop rate was actually increased again. But that doesn't mean that it's the old drop rate. Whereas beforehand you would very frequently get Sulfur, and this morning you got none, now you very inconsistently get Sulfur chunks from the Scorpions. I found quite a few to see how frequently the Sulfur drops are now, and it seems that around roughly half of the mobs dropped Sulfur for me, but many of them also just dropped 1 Sulfur chunk. I occasionally saw 2 or 3, but I've also heard from company mates that they ended up getting even less drops of Sulfur chunks. One of the guys in my company, Robin Hoods, suggested that maybe gathering luck is now a factor in how often you actually get the Sulfur chunks from the Scorpions. This is possible, I haven't fully tested this, but I can say that with gathering luck on my pickaxe at least, and PvP flag for extra gathering luck, I was still not getting all that many Sulfur chunks. I would highly recommend that if you're planning to farm Scorpions now, you get some form of gathering increase. You can, for example, get a 10% gathering increase from the Brimstone Sands fort, and you can obviously use a higher tier proficiency booster as well, just so that whenever you get a Sulfur drop from a Scorpion, you get multiple. In my opinion, the sweet spot for the Sulfur drop rate that the Scorpions have would be somewhere between the previous one and the one that we have now. Each rune glass requires 20 Sulfur chunks, and each fully upgraded hard rune requires 65, so if you're upgrading a full set of your armor gems and your weapon gems as well as 2 hard runes, so you can swap them out, you would look at 270 Sulfur chunks in total, which is a pretty hefty amount. Considering there aren't many spots to farm it, I think a little bit of an increase would be fair. Along with that, we also have a patch with official changes that happened today. Hidden stashes are reactivated again, so if you gather some resources in the wild, just chop some trees, you will get hidden stashes again, which means you can get diamond gypsum again. This is normally supposed to be the placeholder between events, so I'm not quite sure what went wrong, because technically there is the Halloween event right now, but you don't actually get any gypsum from the Halloween event at all. I would have thought that you could just kill the boss for the Halloween event and then get the gypsum from that instead, but that's not the case. This is better for the vast majority of people though, because going for the Halloween event only works on very populated servers and obviously takes quite a while as well, so just going out of town to chop a few cheese is easier. They also fixed the issue with tier 5 legendary crafted bags and tools not getting the additional effect they're supposed to get at 600 gear score. This only happened if you crafted the tool with a crafting mod. And that's probably why it slipped under the radar on PTR, because no one was using crafting mods on PTR because they basically weren't available. But when that change hit live servers, people were obviously using craft mods to guarantee a good perk on their tool, so that was very annoying. However, they already said there will be compensation for affected crafts in the near future. There were a few bugged quests which are now re-enabled, being the Sandwalker's quest, the Roar of the Manticore, and the Queen's Brood. However, there was a nerf along with that. The following quest-related enemies no longer give rewards upon death, including XP outside of the quest items. The Manticore, Herdmaster Metasha, and the Putrid Egg Clutch. This is because, on one hand, these mobs have to be up very often so that people can get them for the quests, but on the other hand, by them being up this often, they were also very easy to farm with a large group. Therefore you could farm weapon XP very easily, especially from the Putrid Egg Clutch. But there was also another concern with more mobs that kind of relates to this, which is the respawn rate for named enemies in Brimstone Sands. What happened was that when many people entered an area and were standing around the same area, the spawn rates for mobs would drastically increase, which makes sense because you have more people that need to do the quest at the same time and they are all farming the same mobs. So the spawn rate going up in that regard is very useful and makes the game more smooth in terms of overall leveling experience in Brimstone Sands or questing experience. The problem with that is, because all the named mobs had these increased respawn rates too, people would just clump around the mobs and farm them over and over and have a very easy time getting a ton of name drops very quickly. I can tell you from my personal experience that the spawn rates difference was absolutely uncomparable. We're doing a bit of a farm run with 6 people around Brimstone Sands on the first day, just looking at different areas and looting the named mobs once or twice, and because we're just a small group and no one else was farming in those places, I would estimate the spawn rates for the mobs were around 6 minutes-ish. Later that night I went down to the place where Legate's ring drops, and that mob was constantly respawning as long as there were a lot of people there. Whenever people left, the spawn rate also noticeably went up in comparison. However, as far as I can tell, this did not affect all areas equally. The high-level elite zones that expect you to go in as a group seem to not have the same effect, at least not with a relatively small number of players. My guess is that the elite areas are coded in a way where they are expected to hold more people in general, because obviously multiple groups can be in there at the same time, and therefore the spawn rates are not getting increased at the same rate, if at all. Whereas small areas or quest areas that don't have much going on otherwise, and maybe hold one named mob, seem to be affected a lot more from what I can tell. We don't know how drastically these spawn rates will be changed now. I hope they're not going too overboard with it and just keep it at a reasonable middle ground where you can reliably farm an item from a mob, but they're also not basically respawning again in 10 seconds. Another small fix was made to misaligned house collision in Everfall, probably because of the redesign of the houses. Now, while AGS changed multiple farms in this patch, that doesn't mean that there aren't some very spicy farms still in the game right now. We'll talk about those very soon, so if you'd like to see them, please consider subscribing and clicking the bell to make sure you can take advantage of them before they potentially get changed as well. And if you haven't seen it yet, I highly recommend checking out my Greatsword guide. I will link it right here, and we have more to talk about with the Greatsword as well. Thanks for watching, Sloth, out.